You are listening to Art Destinations, a podcast where we host fortnightly conversations with artists and thinkers living and or working on islands to see how these unique places shape imaginations. This season will be set in Tasmania, following on from our Venice series. Hello, my name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Lutruwita, Tasmania. We are talking with one of the world-leading philosophers on place, Jeff Malpas, in his study overlooking the Tasman Sea, just south of Hobart. This is an episode where we are thinking on thinking. We question where and how one can do their best thinking, the roles of centre and periphery in the evolution of ideas, how the zeitgeist actually works, and the highly influential role our childhood has on how we think as adults. On our Instagram page, artdestinations.podcast, you can see examples of key sites around the world Jeff has visited that has inspired some of the most profound thinkers. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave a review. Your contribution supports us. Hi Jeff, thanks for coming onto Art Destinations. It's really great to have you here.
Thanks Sarah, it's really great to be here.
So this is really lucky for me. You're one of the world's leading philosophers on place, and it was very special for me because you were helping me work through my PhD for the last 4 years. I'm a photographic artist and I was focused on how place shapes who we are. So that was a massive support for me, so thank you. And so this is a very special episode because I'm able to ask you what it means to be a philosopher and to understand a little bit more about how you're thinking on place. First of all, maybe you could explain to the listeners what a philosopher is and what they do.
Philosophers are defined as the Greek term suggests. We are lovers of wisdom, or sometimes it's put in terms of being lovers of the truth or friends of the truth. And there's something right about that. I mean, maybe we're not quite sure what wisdom is, but philosophers do have an interest in truth. What truth, you might ask? Well, usually the truth that we're interested in is the most fundamental sorts of truths you can think of. So philosophers ask the questions that most other people don't ask. And they're questions about who we are, what where we are in the world, and lots of other questions as well. What sort of lives we should live. If you can think of a question that is more basic than any other, then it's probably the sort of question that philosophers ask. And sometimes that means philosophy overlaps with other disciplines like fundamental physics, and there's an interesting dialogue sometimes between physicists and philosophers. But that's because both physicists and philosophers are asking one question that's very similar to both of them, and that is, what is the world really? What's it made of? What's it like? So philosophers essentially are people who ask questions. And to my mind, it's that asking of questions and asking of fundamental questions that's the most important feature of philosophy. That means that philosophy is not primarily about giving answers, which I think is the mistake a lot of people make. It's about asking the questions. And I think if you do philosophy, if you think seriously, then one of the things you come to realize is that what answers you give depends on the questions and on how you ask the questions. And very often the answers change depending on where you are, which sort of suggests where we might go when we start thinking about thinking, because I would argue that you can't really think about thinking. And that means you can't really engage in thinking, except in as much as you take seriously where you think from and where you are when you think.
So before we go into that, I was just wondering, when did you know that you wanted to be a philosopher?
I always read lots and lots of books. So if we went out on a long drive, I would take an encyclopedia with me because there's always plenty to read in an encyclopedia. And the books, the part of the library that I most used to go to were the 100s. This is in the Dewey system because the 100s that's where all the philosophy books are. Right now, I wasn't thinking them as philosophy books. I was just thinking that the 100s are where you go for all the interesting books that deal with stuff that the other books don't. And I would read everything. So I would read books on mythology, books on ancient science, books on history, usually weird, slightly odd bits of history. So I would read anything that was a bit out of the ordinary. And I wouldn't say that in doing that I'd already decided I was a philosopher. I just followed my nose, as it were, and I followed my nose to the things that interested me, which were things that were a bit out of the ordinary, that were slightly strange, that asked odd sorts of questions, and that dealt with things that weren't dealt with elsewhere. I guess the other thing too is that I as a young child, I read a lot of stories that were about myth, the gods, magic, strange things, not horror. I didn't have much interest in horror or in fairy stories. So I think that's where I began.
And did your parents have trouble keeping the books up to you? Did you have a big library in your house as a kid?
We did have plenty of books, but, almost everybody who I can think of who's ever done anything interesting in terms of writing, whether it's philosophical work or creative writing or poetry or whatever, everybody has a story to tell about how important public libraries are and how important the access to books that public libraries give you is. So, libraries became one of my favourite places. So I'd spend a lot of time in libraries. And you can go to libraries if you don't have much pocket money.
Okay, and so when you're having your ideas or when you're doing your thinking, how do you do that? Do you prefer to be in conversation with people, or do you prefer to think on your own? What's your best way of generating your ideas?
Okay, so I'm a teacher, first of all. So obviously one of the places where I think is when I'm teaching. I think that happens in a special way when you're giving a lecture. It's about standing up there and performing the ideas that you're talking about. And when that's working well, things happen in that situation that you can't predict and that you wouldn't have expected. So very often I've had thoughts or ideas in lectures that I wouldn't have expected or that have suddenly come about that way. That can happen sometimes in tutorials and in conversations. It happens in a different way there. In the lecture, it's a sort of, it's almost as if you just get carried forward by the ideas and you get these sudden flashes of insight where suddenly things come together. When you're talking with somebody else, it's a process of working out in a different sort of a way. And those engagements with others, I think, are those situations where you're communicating and engaging are a really important aspect of thinking. Thinking itself is fundamentally a social activity. It's not an activity you can do just on your own, in a certain sense. And philosophy itself is sometimes said to have its origins in the city, in urban environments, in places where people come together. So Socrates is famously very much a person of Athens who philosophizes in the public place, in the agora, in the centre of Athens. So there's something really important about that. At the same time, philosophy can't be undertaken other than as something that has a certain solitariness about it. Okay? It's not the solitariness of being entirely apart from others, so you don't have to go off into the wilderness in order to philosophize. And the solitariness is more a solitariness that comes about through reflection, through a certain sort of turn inward. Right. Now that is occurring at the same time as there's also a turn outwards. So it's not as if it's one or the other. Philosophy is both social, it involves being with others, but not just gregariousness. It's not just because being with others can also cut off thinking, right? It becomes a way of not thinking. And so it also involves this solitariness, which is not the same as being alone. Right? You can be solitary in the midst of others. You can be solitary when you think with others. The solitariness is about recognizing that the thinking is thinking that you're doing and that you're at stake in the thinking. And I think that's a really important point here. So thinking is fundamentally a thinking that involves oneself and involves, therefore, your own sense of identity. This is also why the being placed of thinking is so important, and why thinking is always a turning back on the place in which you find yourself. That not only reinforces the solitariness, right, it's my place, but it also reinforces why it has to involve others, because what you find in that place where you are is also an engagement with other people, because it's already, as it were, a relational site. So it forces you to engage with others at the same time. So it's always this interplay. This is why the idea of if you think of thinking as a dialogue or a conversation, Hannah Arendt talks about thinking as a dialogue with oneself. And it is a dialogue with oneself, and it's a dialogue with oneself in which you also end up being in dialogue with other people all the time. And in philosophy, you're always in dialogue, you see, not just with the people around you now, but with the philosophers of the past, right? So we're recording this in a room with a whole lot of books around the walls, and all of those books represent voices, other people that constitute the philosophical space that's possible here, and with whom we're in discussion, we're engaged, even when we're not talking about them explicitly, because they fill the sort of space that's possible, that makes the sorts of philosophical discussions we'll have possible. I mean, the reason we think, in one sense, is because we're already in the world and we care about the world. Okay, and so that caring about the world, the being involved with the world, forces us back on ourselves to try and situate ourselves, orient ourselves, if you like. Okay, so a thinking that's not aware of its place, that's lost its place, is thinking that's disoriented, that doesn't know where it is. And for thinking not to know where it is for thinking not really to know what it's about. It's almost for it to have ceased to be thinking, to have become a form of unthinking. Now, I think that actually happens very often in the contemporary world, because the contemporary world has lots of things that lead us to be disoriented and displaced, and that encourage us to ignore where we might be. We always still are somewhere. That's the thing. Whenever we think from somewhere, but sometimes we can think in ways that forget where we are, or that ignore where we are, or that efface where we are. And we do that when we deceive ourselves, we do that when we lie. And that just becomes deeply problematic. It means that we really do lose not just a sense of what we're thinking about, but we also lose a sense of ourselves, and we lose a sense of why anything we're doing matters in the longer term, right? Often people find the turn back to thinking to be quite difficult and sometimes even threatening, because a lot of people don't do it very often, right? I mean, people might occasionally ask themselves questions, but very often those questions aren't really coming back to them. Okay, so that means that philosophy then is a bit peculiar, because it's not something that most people do all the time. They very often are forced to do it in times of extremity, in times of distress. And so to be doing it a lot of the time, as philosophers do, is a bit weird, which is probably why a lot of people think philosophers are strange people, which sometimes they are. It's probably also why one of the peculiar things about being a philosophy professor is that every so often you will get students, or including the parents of students, and I've had this happen, who basically tell you that they're really unhappy about the fact that their son or daughter is doing philosophy. This is in the case of the parents. Because aren't I aware of the fact that philosophy makes people go mad? And this is not an uncommon view for people to have. And then they cite, if they've done a little bit of reading, they cite examples like Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously did go mad, although probably not as a result of his philosophizing. But there is a very widespread view that philosophy is dangerous. Not just politically dangerous or socially dangerous, not just dangerous because it means you're not going to have much of a social life, but dangerous because it's going to harm your mental health. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon, because I think it tells you something about, it's not that philosophy really is dangerous in this sense, but what it's indicating is is a certain truth, which is the way in which what's at stake in philosophy is the being of the philosopher, right? So philosophical thinking in the second sense that I distinguished, that sort of thinking always comes back on you. It's always this attempt to think about who and what you are, that is, to reflect upon your place, to reflect upon place itself.
And maybe people's fear of thinking.
Yeah, well, there are all sorts of reasons for being frightened of thinking, because it might reveal things you don't really want to know about. because sometimes people worry that they will end up in positions that they don't really know how to address. Sometimes because they think that it will corrode the beliefs that have been important, holds that have provided the framework by which they live their lives. From a philosophical view, the commitment has always been to the idea that the value of philosophy, the value of self-reflection, of self-questioning, is a value in itself that goes beyond the value of any of the other things. So, Socrates is famously said to have said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, that's probably a bit extreme, but it certainly expresses a really important point, which is that willingness to examine one's life or to examine oneself, to think back to where one is, seems to be an important feature in being able, if not to live a life, because you can be alive and not do that, but to genuinely live a life where the life is something that you are aware of, that you take a stand in respect of, and that therefore almost becomes something that you are actively involved in responding to and perhaps even in shaping, right? And so you get this idea too in someone like Nietzsche, who talks about living one's life as a work of art, which expresses the same sense, not necessarily that an aesthetic model is the only model, but that a life is something that you take a stand in respect of. And that has other implications as well, ethical implications about integrity and value that we could talk more about.
When there's a concentration of philosophers living in a city, does that dominate the thinking of particular ideas?
Well, some people would say that it has in the past. So a great deal of work has been done on the sudden explosion of German idealism, for instance, which occurs in the 19th century and which is located in very particular places in Germany. And I think it was in Weimar or Jena, there were, in the 19th century, the sort of intellectual ferment was so strong that you were getting lots of philosophers, people thinking philosophy together in the same places, in the coffee houses and so on. And I remember that there's a story about, I think it's in Weimar, where there was a guy who was printing a philosophical newsletter that was coming out every day. And he would go round the coffee houses in the morning, collect all the latest philosophical ideas that were currently fermenting, write this up in the afternoon, print it that evening, and have it on the tables in the coffee houses the next day, right? So, and that sort of ferment has been the focus for a lot of philosophical work on, as I say, the rise of German idealism, which is considered to be this sort of very tight constellation of philosophical ideas that all explode in the 19th century, and that involve people like Hegel and Hölderlin and Schelling and Schleiermacher and Fichte, lots and lots of names that people will have heard of. So sure, when you get enough people who've got the time and the resources to be able to just spend time thinking and the inclination to do so, all sorts of things can happen. Usually it's not just philosophy alone. I mean, I tend to think this is very often in conjunction with other sort of creative developments that happen at the same time, and they feed off one another. I don't think this is well understood by a lot of contemporary governments and so on, who tend to think that somehow this is what's important, is to get the economic side of it right. That's secondary. What you have to get right first is being able to get the people together and the stimulus and the creative energy that means things start to happen. And if you like, the economic success is a sort of consequence of that rather than being something that necessarily drives it. Although, at the same time, it's also true that you need a certain level of affluence, I think, for that sort of philosophical development to occur. Athens is a really good example. Why does philosophy sort of burst into appearance in Athens? Well, partly because Athens was such a successful city-state on somewhat problematic grounds, because its wealth was really based on its empire and its silver mines, which were worked by slaves. But that did make possible a class in Athens who could think about things. Not all of the people who were thinking were the wealthy, because philosophy in Athens was quite varied. But it is important to have a certain sort of freedom from the ordinary constraints so that you can sit there and think. Now, maybe that happens because you've got a job where not great demands are placed on you. Maybe you have to just sit around a lot of the time watching goats or something. One could imagine that happening, but there probably aren't enough people around to stimulate you into really thinking. So because you need other people and you need time on your own, you need a sense of solitariness, that means you probably do need the sorts of structures that come with cities, that come with the sort of wealth that cities can generate. So philosophy is a bit of a luxury in that respect.
Okay. So this one of the things you said prompted me to think about the zeitgeist and how is it that different ideas can percolate in different places and then suddenly there's, you might have an idea and then someone might be doing it in another country or in another city or another place and you've never actually met them or discussed it, but they're just kind of...
Yeah, I don't think of the zeitgeist in the way that a lot of people do, as if there was some sort of miasma or fog that, infiltrated everybody at the same time. That notion of the zeitgeist actually is quite interesting because it originates in the work of a German philosopher. I think it first appears in Herder's work. And it's a translation of a Roman notion which actually refers back to notions of place, not just of time. And I think the notion of the zeitgeist is probably better understood in terms of spirit of place rather than just spirit of time. Okay? And then you can start thinking about it in much more concrete terms because the spirit of place starts to make sense because our thinking is influenced by the way places orient us, the way they direct us. And particularly when you get different places that are being shaped in similar ways because of similar economic, social or political forces, it's not surprising that those different places, even if they otherwise don't have much connection philosophically, might nevertheless give rise to similar ideas because the social, political, cultural and other forces that will have an impact on thinking might well be the same. So in that sense, yes, there can be a zeitgeist, but it's really a spirit, a geist, that is coming out of similar topological configurations of these places. And that, I think, can happen, and that is certainly an important factor. And then, of course, when you do start having people thinking about the same things in different places, then this gets reinforced and it then feeds into the whole process. I would be a little bit wary of the notion of zeitgeist as it's often thrown about, but I think you can make sense of it. But in that case, it's not really that ideas are simply appearing in radically different places. It's because of the way in which these places are reflecting similar shaping forces and so on. When you talk about being in marginal places, so it's certainly true that there are lots of philosophers, important philosophers, who have philosophized at the margins. For instance, in the Enlightenment, it seems to me as some of the most interesting work on the Enlightenment is actually done by philosophers on the edges of Enlightenment Europe, particularly in Scotland, right? That's where Hume is, it's where Adam Smith is. So the best ideas don't always appear at the centre, and the periphery, the margins, often give rise to new things in a way that other places don't. And various people have talked about the importance of margins and peripheries in this way. If you're at the periphery, though, you often feel as if you are on the edge and that it's a constant struggle. If I was in New York, if I was in London, if I was in Cambridge, if I was in Heidelberg or Freiburg or in Hong Kong as it used to be, it's not like that anymore, or in all sorts of other cities around the world, it would be a very different sort of experience. Not only because being in that city would make a difference, there'd be more people to talk to, but it's a lot easier to make contacts with people elsewhere. And that's a problem about being in the southern hemisphere as opposed to the northern hemisphere, about the difficulties in gaining access to other thinkers, but also in being known. So generally speaking, the philosophers that are best known are not those on the periphery. It's those who are working and writing in New York or in Washington or in London or Cambridge or Oxford and in the big universities that are associated with them. And that's has no necessary bearing on the value of what's being said. It's just that if you're at the centre, you're going to get a lot more attention than if you're at the periphery, even though what's happening at the centre may be less interesting than what's happening at the periphery. And there's no obvious way around that. Every so often I think, it would have been, maybe I should have taken that job in wherever, or maybe I should have been more active in trying to be in the US or in, and I've known Kenneth White, for instance. Certainly he felt that his mistake, if it was a mistake, was that he didn't go to the US, and he didn't therefore develop a reputation in the US. And that's not just about, so I would be more famous. It's more to do with the fact that the ideas that you have are what matter in the end. And so it's not being famous that matters or well known, it's having your ideas out there and having other people responding to them. And that can be a bit disheartening, particularly now when, we're flooded with so much material. And it's actually really hard to get for people to read your work. And so then you start to think, well, is it worth writing? Who am I writing for? If it's a handful of people who are reading this, or, if it really is the solitary few. It's all very well for Nietzsche to say, this is philosophy for the few, not for the many. But even so, even he was hopeful that quite a lot of people might actually read what he had to say. So that, I think, is a problem.
But in saying that, as you said before, the ideas or the places being on the margins would really shape or hone your ideas. So I think maybe the last question could be, how do you think Tasmania specifically has shaped your work?
So I grew up in New Zealand, and I had a slightly unusual background in New Zealand because my family moved around a lot. My family worked on showgrounds and so on. So I was born in Australia, moved to New Zealand, grew up in New Zealand. New Zealand, again, is a bit peripheral. I went through a department at the University of Auckland that was quite unusual in some ways, certainly now, because it was strongly historical. We got a very strong training in the history of philosophy. And then I came to Canberra, to Western Australia, then to Europe, and then back to Tasmania. When I got to Tasmania to be interviewed for the job here, what struck me about Tasmania was that it was a bit like coming back to New Zealand, because New Zealand wasn't like Tasmania was then. New Zealand had changed, so it was a bit like going back to the place I'd come from, which didn't really exist anymore. And that was interesting. But the thing that struck me most about Tasmania when I came here was the feeling that for a philosopher who was interested in place, Tasmania was all about place. It was the feel of being a very distinctive place, having a sense of itself, not quite sure what it was, right? But if you like, because its identity was in question, at least that was something that was there. Whereas it doesn't seem to me that comes up in the same way in a lot of other places, particularly mainland places. In Tasmania it is. And it's a question because the population is not large, because the history is so problematic, both the history in relation to the Indigenous population and for the Indigenous population, and in relation to the history of convictism, because it's so far south, because it's an island as well. Islands create these questions of identity for themselves, which I think was why questions of place come to a focus on islands. And because the landscape is also so prominent here, so dominant, in a way that's similar to New Zealand, right? And that means that for me, coming from New Zealand to Tasmania, the landscape was much more immediately meaningful for me in a way that the mainland landscape, the sort of desert landscape of the interior of Australia isn't, right? It's not as if I can look at that and immediately connect with it. I can't immediately identify with that landscape, whereas it's very much easier here. The fact that there is this close relationship between land and sea, that the coastline's so important, and yet you've also got hills and mountains. All of this replicates the same sort of topography and landscape you get in New Zealand. So part of what I brought with me to Tasmania was a whole lot of stuff that reinforced and resonated with what was here already. I think the size of the place meant that it was possible for me to do the sort of work that I wanted to do. That was a really important factor. And there are just, every second person you meet here has something to say about the island or about the place and knows what you mean when you talk about the sense of what it might mean to be Tasmanian as a question. So it's been important for me in terms of reinforcing and feeding into the already existing focus that I had on the issue of place and the relationship between the self or human being and place. It's probably given a different inflection to the way in which I do that, if only because in being here I've had to engage with people and with issues that are specific to this place. And I sometimes think, I used to say, I think that there was probably nowhere in the world that was a better place to be for a philosopher of place than Tasmania. So, yeah, it has been important. As I say, I couldn't give you chapter and verse and point you to just where it matters. And that probably also reflects the fact that it's not only a subtle influence, but it's also quite a pervasive influence.
Yeah, well, you have a really strong sense of place being here, and also looking out from your study at the coastline, and a reminder that you're on the edge of the world or on the edge of a boundary, and you're sort of apart and connected. This is, you mentioned Kenneth White earlier. This is one of the things that I think connected Kenneth and I in important ways. I mean, the place he had in Brittany was on the Breton coast, and the sense of being on the edge, for him on the Atlantic edge, was really important. And I think that's important for me too. But of course that also reflects the fact that I grew up in New Zealand primarily, right, on a coastline with hills behind me. That also tells us something interesting. There's a line in Louise Gluck's work, a poem of hers called Nostos, in which she says, we know the world once in childhood. The rest is memory. And I think that's amazing. It's a really lovely line, right? And it both emphasises the importance of childhood in shaping who we are. It emphasises too the way in which that might be the sense in which somehow we have a sense of being more engaged with the world then, but it is different. It also connects with another line from Ernst Bloch, who at the end of The Principle of Hope, the very famous book he wrote on utopia, he says that utopia is fundamentally about the experience of Heimat, homeland. And that experience, he says, is fundamentally an experience of childhood. Now, there are some people who will say, oh, this is infantilizing, right? Because the one thing we have to do is forget our childhood and grow up. But I also think that's a mistake, that sense of where one comes from, because childhood is not just the point from which one comes. It's not just this chronological past. Childhood is also where one finds oneself now in terms of the origin. I think there's a way of thinking about what has typically been talked about in terms of the idea of the dreaming. The dreaming can refer us to a sort of past, an ancient past, but it also refers us to an originary place that is always there, that we never leave. So the sense in which place and the world are about childhood is the sense in which we are always children. The sense in which our childhood is the place, points us back to the place in which we find ourselves. The thing is, once we grow up, we find ourselves in some sense much more afflicted by the sense of being away from home, of being alienated, of being somehow lost. And so we spend most of our lives trying to work out a way of getting home again, right? Which you never do, right? So, and in fact, being at home is to experience a sense of not being at home. Not as Freud will talk about it, but in the sense I think that's there in Louise Gluck's work. Well, it's a big responsibility for a parent to provide a childhood
that too.
that a child should actually want to come home too. Okay. Well,
but in one sense, that's not entirely up to you. Right? It's not, you don't necessarily have control over that.
No.
You just do your best, but in the end, this is about somebody finding their own way in the world, and nothing you can do can guarantee that or ensure that, because it's not your childhood, not your life that's at issue there, it's theirs. It's their being in the world that's at issue, right? And so that means that there's a strong sense in which this is not to emphasise some sort of empty sense of individuality or self-centeredness. It's just that in the end, everything else matters because we recognise that it matters to us and that it's our responsibility to act on the basis of the fact that it matters, right? So the responsibility is ours. It's not somebody else's, right? And I think that's a really important point. That's why the fact that it's my life that's at issue or my death that's at issue is such an important point, not because it individualises me and sets me apart from everybody else, but because it brings the fact of responsibility back to me. It's about responsibility, about responsiveness.
I think that's a really nice way to end. Thank you so much, Jeff, for coming along.
Well, thank you, Sarah.
There's a lot to think about there.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the second episode of Art Destinations Tasmania. Be reminded about our next fortnightly conversation by subscribing to our newsletter on our website artdestinations.org. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.